Meanwhile, over here we were focused on our own issues. Conservatives were busy voicing their outrage this week over the Supreme Court's 5-4 decision to allow states to count mail-in ballots that come in after the election is over on Election Day, so long as these ballots are postmarked on time. Now, the reality here is this. Whether you agree or disagree, given that the Supreme Court has made its ruling, the only path left is to ensure that all votes are required to be legitimate, which is why the right is doubling down on the Save America Act, requiring voters to present some form of ID proving that they are who they say they are before they can register to vote, in order to ensure that only the people who are entitled to a vote are registered in the first place to do so. And that ensures that our elections have integrity so that the public does not have reason to doubt them or question their results, which is a good thing for all. As for the ruling to count votes that come in after Election Day, as the conservative Justice Samuel Alito wrote in his dissent, it opens up and fails to resolve a host of questions for state election officials and courts, and it creates a serious risk of further undermining public confidence in our elections and our system of self-government. Others chimed in agreement. Missouri's Republican Senator Eric Schmidt said that the Supreme Court's ruling was a shockingly wrong opinion. Justice Barrett joins with the liberal justices to hold that federal election law does not preempt states who allow late mail-in ballots to be counted. This is terrible for election integrity. Another reason we must pass the full Save America Act. By requiring proof of citizenship to vote, the Save America Act would also add restrictions to mail-in ballots, including ID requirements, of which there are usually none for mail-in ballots. Florida's Republican Congressman Greg Stubb echoed the call for the urgent prioritization of passage of the Save America Act, pointing out, the House already passed the Save Act to fix this. The Senate filibuster is the only thing standing in the way. Nuke it. Florida's Governor Ron DeSantis said that allowing, that being the key word, other states to discover ballots once they see how many they need in order to win is a loss for election integrity, but his state will voluntarily choose to play above board, and Florida will continue to only count mail-in ballots that arrive by Election Day. The chairman of the RNC, Joe Grutters, added that if we want fair and secure elections, Election Day should mean exactly what it says, which is why this decision makes it even more important that Congress pass the Save America Act. Democrats are inviting chaos at the ballot box by allowing elections to drag on for days and weeks after voters cast their ballots. The Democrat Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and other Democrats have hid behind the laughably flimsy concerns that the Save America Act could restrict married women from voting if they change their last names and have not received a new passport or driver's license to match that change, as though women are both stupid, too stupid to figure out how to get new ID, and incompetent, meaning being totally incapable of getting their shit together. As a woman, I assure you I'm fully capable of doing both. Thank you very much. Ken Martin, the chairman of the DNC, took it even further than that, claiming that wanting only the citizens that are legally entitled to vote, and wanting them to vote on Election Day, instead of this entirely new system of everyone being held hostage as we wait and see what arrives in the mail, were all people who were clearly maniacal in their intentions, claiming Trump and Republicans are attacking our elections and trying to rig the system in their favor because they know the American people are ready to reject their chaos and corruption this November. The DNC is proud to have stood with the state of Mississippi to defeat the RNC's latest attack on America's voting rights, end quote. My only response is, I guess we'll see what happens in November. The party that does not have the White House always wins the midterms. There has only been one exception to that, and that was during extraordinary times right after 9/11. So I would point out, if you win the midterms, it will literally be par for the course. If you lose them, however, when that has never happened outside of a national crisis, that will be a message of a very different kind. So I guess we'll find out if you are the one with a finger on the pulse of the people. In the meantime, the next day, on Tuesday, the Supreme Court issued another ruling that each state does have the constitutional power to ban biological men from participating in biological women's categories in sports if they choose to. That ruling was written by Justice Brett Kavanaugh and joined by the other conservative justices, in which the Supreme Court decided that Title IX does give schools the right to set their eligibility terms for women's and girls' sports, including basing those requirements on the fixed realities of biological sex, and that doing so is not discrimination, and they cannot be forced to conform to other people's gender ideology. Justice Kavanaugh wrote, quote, "They may determine the eligibility for women's and girls' sports based on biological sex. The Constitution and Title IX do not require an overhaul of women's and girls' sports throughout America." The liberal justices, Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, and Ketanji Brown Jackson, who famously did not know what a woman was because she is not a biologist, agreed with parts of that majority opinion and dissented on other parts. Meanwhile, more than half of the states in this country have already created their laws to protect female sports and intimate places like the locker rooms, and they will now be able to keep those laws as the Supreme Court upheld each state's individual right to create those bans. And they deferred the question of whether Title IX requires states to prohibit transgender athletes from competing outside of their biological category against women under Title IX's explicit purpose of equal rights for women until another day. For the gender activists and the left-wing politicians who chose to champion them, both of whom chose to push this unpopular fight all the way to the Supreme Court, the ruling that they got back is a crushing blow, but one that roughly 80% of the population agrees with. And this is a democracy. The activists and their politicians were specifically fighting Idaho's 2020 first-of-its-kind law, known as the Fairness in Women's Sports Act, which bans male transgender students from competing on girls' and women's sports teams in schools from the elementary level up through college. They were also challenging West Virginia's 2021 law, the Save Women's Sports Act, which bans male transgender individuals from competing on women's and girls' sports teams in public secondary schools and colleges. They are still allowed to compete in lower schools. At the time, ahead of the oral arguments, West Virginia's Attorney General, John McCuskey, said, "The reason that we are here is because Idaho and West Virginia passed common sense laws that delineate the athletic playing fields in our states between the sexes." Riley Gaines, the University of Kentucky swimmer who became publicly known for speaking out after being forced against her will to compete against a mediocre male swimmer from the University of Pennsylvania, Leah Thomas, who was allowed to take wins away from women just because he couldn't begin to cut it and compete with the men, said, "I'm pissed off that we've reached a point where we seemingly have an entire political party who has diminished and erased our rights as women. That's exactly what this is. Don't let them frame it any other way." While the Supreme Court's new ruling stops short of requiring states to separate sports teams based on biological sex, it at least allows them to do so. As Riley pointed out, we are fighting for the bare minimum here. Can we allow ourselves to be vulnerable in an intimate area of undressing, such as a locker room, without having to fear a man walking into that space? Can we do those things? The nation's highest court says we can. Debate over. Next question. That same day, the Supreme Court also ruled 6-3 or 5-4, depending on how you read it, to permanently block President Trump's executive order, which restricted birthright citizenship to only those who are in the country legally, dealing a significant blow to the best and nicest way to end immigration problems by removing the sugar that brings bad actors here. As Justice Alito had said, United States citizenship is precious. Anyone who has attended a ceremony where citizens are naturalized can see that message on the faces of those who take the citizenship oath. Before saddling the nation with a medieval rule, we had better be certain the Constitution requires it. But the majority disagreed with that appropriate standard. Their ruling was authored by Chief Justice John Roberts, in which the Supreme Court held that all children that are born inside the United States to any parents, even if they are here in defiant violation of our laws, or even if they are only temporarily present as tourists, are subject to the jurisdiction of the United States and are therefore citizens at birth under the 14th Amendment. Justice Roberts wrote, quote, "Citizenship, then and now, was the right to have rights, to freely participate in our political community. The framers of the 14th Amendment extended that promise to every freeborn person in this land. We keep that promise today," end quote. Now, that is just not true. Not a word of it. Think about it. There are already rights that non-citizens have here. So citizenship is not something that is owed to all as the foundation of the right to have any rights. The founders started out with votes only being available to white, male landowners. Slaves were excluded, women were excluded, white men who did not own property were excluded. So the idea that they intended for everyone who was inside of our borders to have a vote is something that cannot be backed up. It is entirely ahistorical. And as for the 14th Amendment, it was ratified in 1868, 3 years after the end of the Civil War. It was enacted by our forefathers with the clear, specific intent to guarantee citizenship for former slaves and their children who were all being denied citizenship on the grounds that their parents had never been given citizenship, even though they had been here for generations and were clearly Americans. And even then, the 14th Amendment set up exceptions for children of foreign diplomats and babies that were born to enemies during an invasion, neither of which were subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, even though they were born inside of the borders of the United States, and both of whom had their lack of right to citizenship based on the status of their parents, setting a clear precedent for the framers of the 14th Amendment's true intent, not Robert's fictional PC one. PC being a communist term from the Soviet Union that describes a fact that is not true, but politically convenient. That's actually what that term is. On top of the 14th Amendment itself, subsequent rulings, when it came to Chinese visitors who were here temporarily for work, only reaffirmed that limited intent by not extending birthright citizenship to everyone who is here. Those who are ongoing citizens of another country are not, by reason of that, subject to the jurisdiction of this one, the way that slaves and former slaves were, which is exactly why that clause, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, was deliberately included in the 14th Amendment. If it means what you claim it means, it would have just said, if you're born here, you're a citizen, and it would have left out the part about subject to the jurisdiction thereof. And aside from those legal grounds, there is the simple fact that we are the one and only nation in the world that practices this reckless attitude of giving lawbreakers a legal say in our country. It opens us up to the problems of birth tourism, through which Chinese communists have stolen American citizenship for thousands of their children who have not been raised here with democratic values, that being the important part, but have been raised entirely inside of a communist country without so much as setting foot in America apart from the day of their birth. And yet they have a right to vote on what we do here because of this insanely wild and frivolous interpretation that ignores everything about the text and the context of writing it. As the Solicitor General John Sawyer pointed out, the issue of birth tourism could not possibly have even been contemplated by the authors of the 14th Amendment, arguing, it's a new world where 8 billion people are a plane ride away from having a child who's a U.S. citizen, instead of what used to be a several weeks or months long journey away that would not allow for people to traverse an ocean as a tourist just to steal citizenship and then go back home. And illegal immigration didn't exist. I've gone into all of this in extensive detail before, so if you want the full argument, you can go back and look that clip up, because today has to be about where we go from here. This is a highly faulty ruling, but it is the ruling that we have to work with. unfortunately. Because if they had ruled the other way, it would have been better for everyone. Why? Because now we are going to have to be super harsh on immigration in order to keep illegals from getting in order to keep pregnant tourists out, so that citizenship, and eventually our country through citizenship, is not stolen by people who have never even lived here. It means that we are going to have to get more aggressive on getting illegals out before they have children here, etc., all of which is unfortunate. But that is the only option that they have left us with, unfortunately. If this ruling had gone the other way and removed part of the bad incentives, then we would have been able to afford the luxury of being less harsh on other immigration measures. Now we have no choice, because that is the only option left open to those of us who are unwilling to commit cultural murder-suicide. As for the other judges, Amy Coney Barrett agreed with the 3 liberal justices and voted with them, and Brett Kavanaugh concurred in part and dissented in part with the majority ruling, which is why it can be counted either way. He disagreed with the court's opinion that Trump's executive order violated the 14th Amendment, but he argued that the order did violate other federal statutes, primarily holding to the opinion that only Congress can enact new exceptions to birthright citizenship for children that are born to illegal foreigners or to temporary tourists, which may be true. It depends on whether these are new exceptions or merely the correct interpretation of the existing legislation. Justices Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, and Neil Gorsuch dissented entirely. Justice Thomas wrote, "The court has repurposed the 14th Amendment to protect its own set of preferred rights that the Reconstruction Congress never contemplated, and that cannot find support in its text. Today, the court does so again by recognizing a constitutional right to citizenship for the children of all foreign-birth tourists and illegal aliens." That is true. And yet, Tuesday's ruling ends the matter, unless Congress passes a law, necessitating, unfortunately, harsher crackdowns from here on out. That's the only choice you've left us with this ruling. Last week, Stephen Miller, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, pointed out, if this country doesn't, one way or another, end birthright citizenship, this country doesn't have a future. Citizenship has to be sacred and precious. And as we stand here on the 250th anniversary of America's founding, the idea that we wouldn't have in this country respect and sanctity for citizenship, for the voting franchise, is such an insult to generations of Americans who spilled their blood for our freedom. Yet the path where this could have been fixed by sane and historically sound interpretations of the 14th Amendment has been removed. And now, very strict immigration policies, very strict tourism policies, and very unbending immigration enforcement is the only option that they have left us, because surrender and failure in preserving this last refuge of liberty is not an option.